Chapter 12, Nerves, Annoying Thoughts, and Hasty Arrangements. Lord Melbourne arrived at Buckingham Palace shortly after Peel gave her the news of the result of the parliamentary vote to Victoria. He came riding in a hurry on his steed and dismounted with energy and elegance. Lord Melbourne waited in a room for Victoria, nervous. It was not long before she came to meet him, and almost running she threw herself into his arms, and Lord Melbourne hugged her tightly. After a few minutes they both parted a little, but still hugging, and Lord Melbourne saw her directly in the eyes. "You see, Victoria. I told you that you should be calm and patient. Fortunately there has been a favourable outcome, and we can breathe easier. I confess that at the beginning of all this I doubted our chances, even though your uncle Leopold was very clever, securing the support of the Conservative Party with his agreement with Peel and Wellington. But naturally we had strong opposition, but we have bowed down it, and it has been largely thanks to the efforts of my friend George. We owe him a lot of, Victoria," said Lord Melbourne. Then Victoria and Lord Melbourne talked for a few minutes about the role played by Lord George in the triumph of the efforts to obtain the approval of public opinion and Parliament. "Really, Lord George is a noble and loyal friend. I would like to do something to thank him for his generosity with us," said Victoria. "Your friendship is enough for him, although his daughter is another story. That little girl adores you, considers you a kind of idol, as if you were a princess of fairy tales. She adores you with an almost religious devotion, to the point that she collects all the things that have to do with you. I'm sure if she knows you in person, the poor girl would faint with emotion," replied Lord Melbourne. "Really? I never imagined that a little girl would feel that, for me," Victoria said, surprised. "I think it's not the only one. I'm sure there are many girls in the country who feel the same. After all, you are the first queen so young and beautiful that we have had, at least in many generations. It is normal that your image awakens the fantasies and admiration of the girls of the country who would like to be you, to be in your place," Lord Melbourne said, smiling. "I am moved to know it." Victoria replied with a sweet smile, "I want to meet the girl." "But does the girl live with George or with her mother in Ireland?" Victoria asked curiously, thinking that the girl was the daughter of George's legitimate wife who lived separated from him in Ireland. Lord Melbourne put a gesture of embarrassment on his face. "It's just that, she is not the daughter of Lord George's wife, she is the daughter of George's current companion," answered Lord Melbourne with some discomfort. Victoria was a little surprised. "So the child is the daughter of Lord George's mistress?" Victoria asked. "I think that for George she is more than a mistress. In fact, I think he would resent it qualifying her with that term. For him in practice she is his real wife, and I am sure that if he could marry her, he would. You should know that life is very complicated, Victoria, and nobody, absolutely nobody, is morally perfect. Nobody has an irreproachable behavior. You know it, Victoria, because neither you nor I are it," said Lord Melbourne, a little serious. Victoria was a little embarrassed, aware that Lord Melbourne was saying it in large part because her would marrying him while she was pregnant with another man, with whom she lost her virginity as a single young woman. "It is not my intention to judge Lord George and the people he loves. Of course I could not be ungrateful with a good friend of yours whom I owe so much. And of course I still want to meet the girl. I am moved by her devotion," Victoria replied honestly. "I'm glad to hear it, Victoria. It's a gesture that honors you, but now we must focus on your situation," Lord Melbourne replied, and then he sought asides, as if he were making sure they were alone, and lowered his voice to continue, "Victoria, we must hurry things, because the physical signs of your condition could begin to be noticed," he added uncomfortably. Victoria opened her eyes in amazement and saw to Lord Melbourne looking at her belly, so Victoria looked down to see her own belly, which it was certainly seem a little more bulky. "God, do you think it is already noticeable on me?" Victoria exclaimed nervously in a low voice. "No, you must not worry, but we must rush the court bureaucrats and all those involved. Now that we can legally move forward, we should not waste a minute," replied Lord Melbourne, trying to reassure her. The following days were frantic with pressure from Victoria to accelerate the gears of the Crown bureaucracy and discussions with the officials involved. Preparations were made at the fastest possible speed, and Prime Minister Peel did everything possible to help Victoria achieve her goal of hastening the wedding. The date of the wedding was set for just over 2 weeks after Parliament's approval of the legal changes and agreements on the status of future consort of the Queen. Although some members of Parliament close to the sinister Duke of Cumberland came to propose a morganatic marriage, whose main consequence would have been to deprive the children of marriage of the right to succession to the crown of their mother, the strong opposition of Victoria and the Peel ministry, with the backing of most of the press and public opinion, frustrated the maneuver of Victoria's enemies. The legislative changes guaranteed the succession for the children of the marriage of a monarch with at least one member of the nobility, and not necessarily of the royalty. Anyway, the title of William Lamb was elevated from Viscount Melbourne to Duke of Melbourne, a modification of the title of the head of the Lamb family that became effective 1 week before the wedding. The constant and strenuous activity kept Victoria and Lord Melbourne busy. Just over a week before the wedding, Victoria was undergoing a test with the wedding dress. It was a white satin dress, made of fabric woven in Spitalfields, adorned with a deep flounce and trimmings of lace handmade in Honiton and Beer, in Devon. Handmade lace motifs were applied it on a machine-made cotton net. The dress had a train of 18 feet, 5.5 m, long. After the costume designers and dressers performed the test, they left Victoria alone with her mother, Baroness Lazen, and Miss Scarratt, who was to help Victoria undress. The women talked about the test. "This is a problem. I think it noticeable on her, the stomach a little bulky," said the Duchess between irritated and worried. Victoria made a gesture of fear and deep concern on her face. "Your Highness, I do not think that's the case, it shows very little, almost nothing," replied Baroness Lazen, trying to reassure Victoria and making an effort to hide her anger with the Duchess for anguishing Victoria. "What do you think, Scarratt?" Victoria asked anxiously, addressing her maid. "Your Majesty, I think your belly has bulged very little, and with the last adjustments that were made to the dress, I think that in the worst case it will notice very little, almost nothing. And during the ceremony most of attendees will not have a very close vision of you so that they can realize, and even less the crowd that will be outside. I think you should not worry, ma'am," Scarratt replied, speaking cautiously and with a certain shyness. "In any case, I hope the child is born late, so as not to incite inconvenient and dangerous rumors," said the Duchess with a sigh, in a pessimistic way, causing Victoria to return to show anguish, and Lazen saw the Duchess with gesture of anger for anguishing Victoria. The women continued to discuss the technical details of the wedding and the dress. Later, Victoria was alone with Scarratt, the Queen dressed in her sleepwear. "Scarratt, there's something else I wanted to talk to you about my wardrobe on the day of the wedding." "It's about my nightgown for the wedding night," Victoria said shyly and while she blushed. "Of course, tell me what you want, Majesty," replied Scarratt with a certain embarrassment. "Scarratt, you know my intimacy, even my biggest secret, that's why I can trust you. I've talked about this with my mother, but I'd like to talk to someone who is almost as young as me," said Victoria. Victoria told Scarratt about her conversation with her mother about her intimacy with Lord Melbourne when they were both married. Scarratt listened to her with attention and understanding, empathizing with Victoria's nerves and insecurity. "Your Majesty, I believe that the advice of your Highness, your mother, is very good. I believe that your married life with Lord Melbourne will be very happy, and you should trust Lord Melbourne's love for you. But, your Highness also has reason when she says that you must be patient and understanding with him. Maybe at the beginning Lord Melbourne could avoid the physical contact, but in that case you should not be discouraged thus. It would be natural in your current condition, it could even be a kind and considerate gesture on the part of Lord Melbourne," Scarratt said prudently. "Yes, I understand," Victoria replied with some discouragement. "But it is not necessarily what has to happen, the opposite could also happen." Scarratt replied, trying to encourage the Queen, "That is why, we will find the appropriate nightgown for that night, a beautiful and suggestive nightgown, which can incite Lord Melbourne to follow the path desired by you," Scarlett added, a little embarrassed and blushing. Victoria smiled sweetly and a little naughty, and saw Scarlett with a look of complicity. "That seems very good to me, Scarlett, thank you very much for understanding my wishes so well," answered Victoria, animated. A couple of days later, Lord Melbourne and Lord George were talking in a drawing room in the Lord George's mansion in London, sitting in armchairs, while both leafed through the newspapers, with the news of the impending wedding. Lord Melbourne looked slightly worried and absent, while George was quite animated. "How does it feel to be about to become the consort of the Queen, Duke of Melbourne?" exclaimed George mockingly. Lord Melbourne closed the newspaper in his hands and placed it on a table beside him, crisscrossed the fingers of both hands, letting them rest on his lap, and raised his head to see the ceiling. "Do you remember that trip we made with your father when we were teenagers?" "The trip to Dover," said Lord Melbourne. "Yes, of course, it was unforgettable. We had a great time," replied George, smiling. "Do you remember when we stopped at that inn before we got to Dover? And while your father was meeting with that man with whom he was going to do business, we went out to wander in the vicinity of the inn. And then we heard those two men arguing in the barn, and we started spying to see them and listen what they said in the middle of the discussion," Lord Melbourne recalled. "Of course, they were two poor peasants, and one of them was crying disconsolately because he had seen the woman he was in love with another man, and his friend was trying to comfort him," said George. "Yes, that poor man had seen the woman he was deeply in love with, having sex with another man in the middle of the field. With the skirt up, and the man on top of her with his pants down, fornicating in the middle of the field, on the grass. And naturally the man had a broken heart, he had gotten drunk and cried and almost shouted while his friend tried to comfort him. But do you remember what the poor man said that attracted to so much our attention?" "What was so rude?" replied Lord Melbourne. "You mean?" George began to answer. "He said, 'How can a man endure to see the woman he loves when another man stick his dick in her?' The fact of knowing with certainty that another man has stick his dick in the woman you love, that's more or less was what the man said, and of course we has make fun and laughed later, because we were two teenagers immature and stupid, and it caused us laughter, the suffering of that unfortunate. Many things have happened since then, many," said Lord Melbourne of reflective way. "William, does this have to do? I thought we had already overcome that facet," George exclaimed with some despair. "Believe me, George, I have already understood and accepted the issue of Victoria's pregnancy, and if there was something to forgive, I would have sincerely forgiven it. But the fact that I have assimilated it and resigned myself to the situation, and that I have banished the rage of my heart, it does not mean that it does not continue to cause me pain. I cannot forget that Victoria gave herself to Prince Albert out of love and desire, that she was in his arms and that she expects a child from him. I am sure that with the passage of time I will be able to overcome it completely, it will only be a bad memory, and I will do everything necessary to love that child as if it were my child, and I will strive to be a good husband, because I love her, but I am worried about the beginning of our marriage. The beginning of our coexistence," said Lord Melbourne. Lord Melbourne stood up and walked to a window to see outside, and then continued talking. "All this has been very strange and precipitate. One day Victoria was close to marrying Albert, and the next day he was dead, and then I was engaged in marriage with her, and now we are getting married, and everything happened from a way, so shocking and fast. We're going to get married, but not because we've wooed and fallen in love with each other, not because I proposed marriage to her or she to me, for love, but because I had to save her from the scandal, from a catastrophe. We got married practically for duty, for obligation, not as a romantic adventure, and if in itself that was not uncomfortable and strange enough, she carries in her belly the child of the other man, of my rival for her affections. In this situation, I do not know what to do. I do not know how to behave, I do not know what our coexistence will be like when the wedding ends, that is, I do not know what to expect from those remaining months until Victoria gives birth to her child. Everything will be strange and embarrassing, including the alleged honeymoon, which will not be such, explained Lord Melbourne. So, do you discard having a normal honeymoon? Asked George. How could she, George? She's pregnant with child of another man. Obviously we cannot have normal relations between newlyweds. Lord Melbourne answered, turning to see George, and obviously Victoria knows it. She should not have expectations of something happening, he added while he returned to see outside. Are you sure, William? Asked George with doubt and some skepticism. She cannot think otherwise, exclaimed Lord Melbourne, surprised and defensive, while turning to see George. If something has taught us life, William, it is that women are unpredictable. I would not be so sure in your place that she wants the same as you and that she thinks the same way about you in this matter, or in any other. If something it taught me my unhappy marriage is that a wife is a box of surprises not always pleasant. George replied with a grimace of disgust, what I say is that you must be prepared, maybe Victoria may have different expectations to yours, added George. I really do not think so. Lord Melbourne answered, but there was doubt in his voice. She is pregnant, so I do not think she has those desires, especially with the discomforts that she is suffering and the anguish she has for her situation. Besides, just a few weeks ago she was in love with Prince Albert, and she was in his arms. I do not think she has forgotten so easily. And she must also think that it would be strange and unpleasant, very shocking, to have intimacy with me while she is pregnant with another man. That would be unimaginable, added Lord Melbourne, still hesitant. Well, if you say it, but then, what will your marriage be like during pregnancy? Said George. That is what I do not know. Well, in public we will have to pretend that we are a happy and in love couple, who are eagerly waiting for our first child. Lord Melbourne replied with a grimace of annoying resignation, in private I suppose there will not be many changes. Everything will be the same as it is now, with the difference that I will live in the palace, Lord Melbourne answered, a little discouraged. William, I just hope that after so much effort, so much struggle to get this marriage done, do not waste the opportunity to be happy. You would be a fool if you did, and I could not forgive you, said George, serious and a little worried about he. Do not worry, George. I'm not that stupid, replied Lord Melbourne with an affectionate smile. The next day George's family arrived at his home in London, and Lord Melbourne came to greet his best friend's family. After greeting Eleanor affectionately, he was reunited with little Elizabeth. Hello Miss Elizabeth, did you miss your Uncle William? Lord Melbourne said, smiling and affectionate, with one knee on the floor, to greet the girl. I'm happy to see you, Uncle William, replied little Elizabeth with a shy smile, and always looking very polite, like a whole aristocratic young lady, and older than her age. Did your father give you the good news? Lord Melbourne asked happily, and then he saw George, who with a smile shook his head. Your father will attend my wedding with Queen Victoria and you will accompany him. Elizabeth opened her eyes in surprise and saw her father, who nodded, and then the girl began to cry of emotion, and moving, Lord Melbourne embraced her, while he and George laughed.